So the Bangladesh crisis again moving on with the interim government in Bangladesh led by the new chief advisor, Muhammad Yunus, taking office. Now this is following the fall of Sheikh Hasina's government in Dhaka, something that has acquired a lot of interest in India as well as abroad. One of the major players in this entire crisis, and of course in the diplomatic run-up to what was happening in Bangladesh, was the United States, as there have been some rumored tensions between India and the United States on the question of Bangladesh. Joining us to explain what the US policy is on Bangladesh, how Washington is seeing what's happening in Dhaka right now, is Michael Kugelman, one of the most renowned US experts on South Asia. Michael, thank you so much for joining us. Could you begin, I suppose, by just walking us through how the United States is seeing what has happened in Bangladesh over the last week or so, how they're seeing the formation of the new interim government? Could I also ask you to lay out something that has been talked about for a long time, which is Washington's discomfort with the Sheikh Hasina government in Dhaka, or you may choose to dispel that notion if you so please, but could you begin by telling us a little bit about how Washington is seeing what's happening in Dhaka?
Yeah, thanks for having me. So I think that the U.S. government had been very concerned by what had been playing out over the last few weeks in Bangladesh, certainly with the unrest, the violence, and then really the uncertainty about what was coming, particularly right after Sheikh Hasina resigned. My understanding is that the U.S. government is very comfortable with the new interim government that's now in place in Bangladesh. In fact, the State Department spokesperson said that we look forward to working with the interim government. And I believe that the U.S. charge d'affaires at the embassy in Dhaka attended the swearing-in ceremony for Muhammad Yunus in the interim government. We know that the U.S. Is very comfortable with Muhammad Yunus. I mean, this is someone that has very good ties with many U.S. leaders and so on. That's no secret. So I think that the U.S. is much less concerned now than it had been a few days ago. But I think moving forward, the big concern for Washington is that there is some type of plan that develops in a time frame in terms of what happens next with this interim government. I don't necessarily think that the U.S. would be looking to want to see elections very soon. I think that it understands that the country is in a very precarious, volatile state now, and that time may need to be taken to ensure that law and order is restored, and that the interim government works to develop its mandate and its plan to move forward. Now, in terms of the issue of the U.S. approach to Bangladesh over the years and its relationship with Sheikh Hasina and the Awami League. No, absolutely. I mean, if we look at recent history, the U.S. had done things that upset Sheikh Hasina and the Awami League, particularly with this very vocal criticism, very public and vocal criticism of Bangladesh's rights and democracy situation, a lot of public focus on the need for free and fair elections. And, as we all know, this did not go down well with Sheikh Hasina and her party. And here, as you well know, Hasina and her party have made 1971 such a big focus of contemporary politics. It's very difficult to move away from that. And I can understand why. But, this is why the U.S. position in 71 is something that has remained foremost on her mind and the minds of her party members for many years. And this is why there's going to be that suspicion and concern about any type of U.S. criticism, the fear that would attract concern about meddling and so on. Again, going back to the fact that the U.S. supported the Pakistan Army in 1971. But it is not true, in my view, that the U.S. government preferred an alternative to Sheikh Hasina. Let's be very clear. When the BNP was in power some years back, the U.S. was very vocal in expressing its concerns about repression that took place in the BNP era as well. And the final point I'll note is that in the few weeks before Bangladesh's election earlier this year, the U.S. actually went quiet. The U.S. government stopped commenting publicly and stopped sort of bringing attention to the need for a free and fair election. And right after Hasina, won that election, which in my view wasn't a real election because the opposition boycotted, President Biden sent a letter to Sheikh Hasina saying, "We welcome this new era in U.S.-Bangladesh relations." The messaging from U.S. officials was very different, much more of a focus on working strategically. And I think it concluded that, perhaps by pushing, criticizing Hasina and the Awami League, think that there is concern that that could risk pushing the Awami League and that the government at that time more toward China. And I think also just for practical reasons, the U.S. not wanting to do anything that could cause concerns, security concerns for its people in Bangladesh. We know that Peter Haas, the ambassador, had experience in cases of being harassed and hassled by some Awami League folks. So it's actually a very complex issue if you look at the U.S.-Bangladesh relationship. The relationship on the whole has actually been quite good over the last few years. Trade ties have gone up. There's been a lot of talk about Indo-Pacific issues. There are some convergences there. Military collaborations have picked up as well. So it's actually has been in a pretty good position.
Right. Could I ask you a little bit about what has been seen in India, at least, as and this is the commentary which I'm relaying to you about somehow a hypocritical double standard when it comes to, let's say, Bangladesh not being invited to the summit for democracy, but Pakistan was. This idea that, the United States has repeatedly commented. Of course, you pointed out that the policy has changed, but at least in the lead up to the election for a while before, there was a sense that America, of course, does not comment very much at all on what is happening in Pakistan. But, for example, there seems to be a special standard for Bangladesh for criticism of the government. And in India, that acquired some concern because the idea was that, look, you may sort of attack Hasina's government, but the alternatives are far, far worse. That was the Indian criticism, which I am conveying to you. So what do you think of that line of argument that, in fact, that the United States has seemingly treated these two countries very differently, that Bangladesh, albeit a flawed democracy, is a democracy, whereas Pakistan is invited to the summit for democracy, but of course, has those very same problems as Bangladesh. So you think there was differential or hypocritical treatment?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the polite way of putting it is that the U.S. is selective in terms of how it applies its democracy promotion strategy. One could also say that it is hypocrisy. Absolutely. I mean, this is very clear. I mean, we know that in Pakistan, the state of democracy has been dreadful pretty much all the time, unfortunately, but particularly over the last few years after Imran Khan's ouster, you had a particularly intense level of repression and so on. And indeed, the U.S. was much more quiet about that than it was with Bangladesh. Look, I mean, it comes down to the issue of interest. And this is why it's always a risk when a country, whether it's the U.S. or another, elevates the idea of a values-based foreign policy. If you start, saying that you're going to make democracy and human rights a big part of your foreign policy, you set yourself up for criticism when you succumb to the need to elevate and emphasize interest, because, for reasons of U.S. interests, it's going to not be as pushy. It's not going to bring as much attention to rights and democracy concerns in Pakistan as it is in Bangladesh. And that is because the U.S. has concluded that it has an interest in working with those in power in Pakistan. And with Bangladesh, it's never been completely clear why the U.S. has decided to make Bangladesh, or had decided to make Bangladesh, a focus and what I would describe as a test case for its values-based foreign policy. But one reason is, I would argue, that the U.S. views Bangladesh as strategically significant, but not so strategically significant that it can't afford to risk upsetting or alienating the government in power by pushing on the democracy issue. I would also argue that the U.S. likely sees that Bangladesh does have a tradition of democracy. You have had successful democracy. You have successful democratic institutions. Whereas in Pakistan, it's much different. In Bangladesh, there were, during its early years, periods of military rule, but then you did have an interregnum where you had democracy. And Bangladesh is, oftentimes, rightly so, in my view, described as a moderate state. It's not a dangerous. It's just a very different scene. So I think that the U.S. was hoping that by taking this position of pushing Bangladesh, that it would be able to help move the needle forward back toward bringing back what had been there in the past, where there was more democracy. This is the U.S. view. Obviously, it didn't work. But yes, short answer to your question is absolutely there's been selectivity in terms of how the U.S. Applies the democracy promotion issue in both Pakistan and Bangladesh. But as I said before, the U.S. did make a course correction, that during the last few months of Sheikh Hasina's time in power, and then going back to the few weeks before the last election, it did take a very different position. And I think it decided to simply bring more balance to the values and the interest sides of its relationship with Bangladesh.
Right. If I can ask you two final questions. The first one is, there is a suspicion sitting here in Delhi, of course, that, and I would like you to comment on it, that America was keen to see Sheikh Hasina go. There is the charitable view, which was articulated by some, which was saying that, look, America has sort of reduced that this sort of managed stability policy on Sheikh Hasina's side was not going to work, that the country was fundamentally angry about problems like inflation, growing authoritarianism. They wanted to see her go. She was out of touch. And so America was simply getting ahead of the curve by pushing her, lightly pushing her out or having her a hand to her back as she was leaving the door. The uncharitable view, of course, is that, as you were pointing out, that they simply felt that the way her politics was, that she had clashed with America one too many times. They simply weren't comfortable with her, and they wanted to push her out and replace her with someone, or replace her, that is the phrase that is being used, with someone much more amenable to American interests, someone like Muhammad Yunus. Could I ask you to comment on that a little bit? Because that is a particularly harsh brand of criticism that we're seeing in India about what the US policy has been. Could I ask you to comment on those two things? Number one, was America keen to see Sheikh Hasina go? And number two, which view do you subscribe to? That if so, was America charitably, if we choose to look at it, did it just have its finger on the pulse and knew that the country was already moving in that direction? Or the slightly uncharitable view was that they didn't like how Sheikh Hasina treated them, or saw America's role in her country's history?
Yeah, so I mean, as I said before, as I said several times, the U.S. Made very clear over the last few months that it wanted to have a fresh start in its relationship with Sheikh Hasina's Bangladesh. Again, President Biden sent the letter saying we look forward to this new era in relations, which doesn't suggest to me that he and his administration were hoping that she would hit the road. Now, certainly, there were concerns. The U.S. had a lot of concerns about her and her government. But again, looking at how the rhetoric and the narratives changed from the U.S. during the last few months of her time in power, it suggests that they had, acknowledged that it was necessary to work with her and her government for strategic reasons. Certainly, I think the U.S. might see the benefits of a fresh start, so to speak, with a new administration now led by Muhammad Yunus, someone that they definitely are very comfortable with. But as I said before, the U.S. is very concerned about the current situation because there's so much volatility and so much uncertainty. That gets me to the other issue, and maybe this gets to your point about the uncharitable view here. I've heard a lot of criticism about the U.S. meddling and this what I view as an absurd conspiracy theory that the U.S. sponsored this mass movement in Bangladesh. Think of it this way: why would the U.S. want to be behind a movement that results in an outcome that has emboldened some very violent actors, particularly religious fundamentalists? That's one thing. Why would it want to be behind a movement that leads to an outcome that could actually be very beneficial for China, assuming this stability is restored and so on? I think that the new government, which we don't know what it'll look like, but it won't be Awami League, whatever the new government is in place, will not feel constrained by needing to make sure it doesn't do anything with China, which India would not want to see. So I think that the new government is going to openly pursue very strong ties with China. And of course, Sheikh Hasina had very good relations with China. You had India-China defense and economic ties grow in a big way during the Sheikh Hasina era. But there were certain things that she, I think, was not willing to do because of her very close relationship with India. You're not going to have that with the next government in Bangladesh. So in other words, among other things, it would not serve U.S. The outcome of this mass movement could lead to some new realities that do not really work well for U.S. strategic interests.
Right. But if I could ask you if I could just push you slightly on that, because there have been a number of reports that Dhaka Tribune, for example, reporting that U.S. diplomats were meeting leaders from Jamaat, which is an Islamist party. There was a lot of favorable comment from the Bangladesh Nationalist Party when the Sheikh Hasina government was clashing and America was threatening visa sanctions on Bangladeshi officials that interfered with the elections. So the line of argument again, and I'm sorry to articulate the uncharitable view again, is that America has actually, unlike India, been putting its eggs in different baskets. There are reports that it's met with Jamaat, that it's met with BNP. And again, I'm saying that the uncharitable view, forgive me for articulating it, is that the Americans have feathered their nest with other parties. And if a BNP Jamaat coalition were to come up, that it has made sure that its strategic interests are taken care of. Could I ask you then to respond to that?
Well, I mean, I think that this is typically how diplomacy works. That if you're an ambassador serving in another country, then generally speaking, you're going to meet with many different political parties and political factions, not just the ruling party. And this is a criticism that's come up in a Pakistan context as well. Many Imran Khan supporters have wondered why U.S. diplomats are meeting with leaders of other parties. That's how U.S. diplomacy works. I'm sure that's how Indian diplomacy works as well. This is just the way it works. Yes, the U.S. did take very hardline measures against Bangladesh, sanctioning RAB, imposing visa restrictions, and so on. And it has not done anything like that in any other country in South Asia other than Afghanistan, where, of course, the Taliban leadership have been sanctioned for many years. But I don't see how you can draw a link between that and some type of complicity in a regime change operation. I think it's important that we not take away agency from young people. This is a remarkable development in Bangladesh, that you had young people that were dealing with rising economic stress, and they were very upset about a particular policy, this bringing back job quotas. They were on the receiving end of a horrific crackdown on the part of the Bangladesh security forces, and they got angry, and then they turned violent, and then it led to a bigger movement, drawing a lot of public support. And that's in my view what happened. And I don't see why there's any need for there to be any type of external sponsorship from that, including from the U.S. But absolutely, I acknowledge that point, that given how the U.S. has approached Bangladesh, given that it's done things with Bangladesh that it has not done with other countries in South Asia, including imposing sanctions and taking other harsh steps, that one might think they would have a certain interest in another government being in place. And as I said before, the U.S. may see opportunities for a fresh start to work with Muhammad Yunus for however long he's running the show. But again, I see this as a very organic, really spontaneous mass movement that rose up in Bangladesh. And I think that's something that should be appreciated, or at least acknowledged for what it is.
Right. And my final question to you, Michael, is how do you see this impacting the India-US relationship? There has been a lot of conversation about how this has been a subject of some friction between the two sides, given that India has tried to shield Sheikh Hasina from some global diplomatic pressure, especially on her human rights and democracy record. Moving forward now, how do you see this being a subject of friction between the two countries, or do you think that they'll get together on the same page and say that we're of course facing the same uncertainties when it comes to Bangladesh? Let's work together. How do you see Bangladesh featuring in the India-US relationship?
I don't think it'll be that big of an issue for the U.S.-India relationship, especially if you, again, look at how the U.S. position changed a bit during the last few months of Hasina's term, that it was really not pushing that rights issue and democracy issue as much. And at the end of the day, the U.S. and India are on the same page in Bangladesh, right? They want a government in place. Well, they want stability. They want a government in place that would not want to move too close to China. So I think here there's actually an opportunity for the U.S. and India. You no longer have you have a very different political reality than you did just a few days ago. And I think that there could be opportunities for more convergences between the U.S. and India. They're both, I think, very concerned about what could be coming next. India is particularly I think impacted, particularly because of border security implications, and of course, just the fact that its closest partner is not in power anymore. But I think that the strategic goals are very similar between the U.S. and India, and that's hopefully is something that can be leveraged. Just like region-wide, the U.S. and India share a lot of common interests in terms of wanting to see stability, right, wanting to develop policies that can counter China, and so on.
Understood. Michael Kugelman, thank you so much for your time, for laying out a lot of what the U.S. policy has been on Bangladesh, on the Awami League, what it is likely to be moving forward, answering a lot of questions and frankly some of the concerns that we've seen in India regarding America's policy on Bangladesh. But that's all from us. Thank you so much, Michael, for your time, and thank you for watching India Today Global.